Welcome to the Draft Deeper podcast. This is your host, Nathan Grubel. Joining me as always is my producer, Kevin Black, aka the best producer in the business. And for his last show during this 2022 NBA draft cycle, don't worry, we say those words. Stephen will definitely be back with Draft Deeper next draft cycle. But for this 2022 period, this is his last show with me tonight. Stephen Gillespie, probably a lot of emotions, my friend, but we watched the wild lottery. Everything's just hitting you all at once. How are you doing? What are your raw feelings and emotions as we get ready to dive into what we're doing tonight?
Oh man, it's I'm a dad, I'm a husband, I'm an emotional cat. There's a lot going on internally right now, Nathan. First off, big ups to you. Shouting out Kevin. He is the best producer in the business. Love the fact that I get to be on the show with you guys. I'm an emotionally charged just machine tonight. I get to talk draft. I get to hang out with my friends. Like, this is a great time. We get to talk to the Draft Deeper faithful. It doesn't get better than this, man. I'm excited.
So let's just jump right into it. This was, oh my gosh, it wasn't a lottery that was off the rails in terms of like multiple people jumped into the top four, Stephen, but we did have one team jump in. That was the Sacramento Kings.
Yeah.
Leapfrogging multiple teams. Most notably, the Detroit Pistons fell out of the top four and now sit at the 5 spot. When we run through a lottery mock draft, which we're going to do on this show momentarily, I'm very curious to see who ultimately lands at that spot with the Detroit Pistons as number 5. And Sacramento moves up to number 4.
Mm-hmm.
The Houston Rockets at the number 3 spot. Oklahoma City at the number 2 spot. So close. Shout out to Thunder Chats. Shout out to Topic Thunder. They were so close to getting the number 1 pick, but I still think they sit pretty at number 2. And then number 1, the Orlando Magic. I did a podcast yesterday with Max Van Auken. This audience will be listening to that podcast on Thursday. We talked about situations in which what would the Orlando Magic do if they got the number 1 pick? Who would they ultimately go with? And we threw out all 3 of the top names. We threw out Jabari Smith, Chet Holmgren, Paolo Banchero. Max and I talked about how we think they would go with Chet Holmgren at number 1 if they got the number 1 pick. But then I said back, Stephen, I said, I really think Paolo is the best fit with that team. And it's been a popular opinion on multiple draft funds, I think, for a few months now. And I've been a big guy who's argued, and I did so on that podcast episode that everybody will end up hearing. I did argue for Jabari Smith to also be heavily considered for that spot, just because of the proximity, right? Like, those Orlando Magic scouts don't have to travel far to go to Auburn and see Jabari Smith and just completely come back to the war room, like pounding the table. Oh my gosh, like, we've seen this guy so many times this year, and every single time he's delivered. Like, why would we not take this guy with the number 1 overall pick? So I think, Stephen, because Orlando got number 1, I think this race is wide open. Not that it wasn't already wide open, but I think between those 3 guys, this race is 100% wide open. What are your initial reactions to Orlando getting the number 1 pick?
I mean, it's wild. You never expect a team like Orlando to take it, especially with the company that was in there. I was really thinking that Detroit might have a really good shot at landing the top pick. Houston is on this incredible rebuild. You and I were both big fans of what they did last season. We have a lot of friends and colleagues now and associates that are deep into the Oklahoma City community, and they've been nothing but kind to us. And, it's just wild, man. Orlando, when we wrote our 5 questions, which are, or when we answered our 5 questions, which you can find on the No Ceilings NBA website, a lot of folks had different, viewpoints within our collective on who needs the number 1 pick the most. And I picked the Orlando Magic because I talked about how Oklahoma City, they have Giddey and SGA. I talked about Houston and they have Jaylen Green. And even though Bill Simmons may say F Jaylen Green, obviously joking, like, there was nothing foul play there, in my opinion. But, and then Detroit, they have Cade Cunningham. These teams have bright futures. Orlando just has like a nice cast of, good to great bench players and ancillary players, but they don't have a number 1 option. And now this draft class may not ultimately yield like a tier 1 type of player, Nathan, that you're accustomed to evaluating. But if any team needs a shot at potentially getting the best player out of any draft class, to me, is the Orlando Magic. So I'm excited to see him here at number 1.
So you kind of talked about some of the team constructions, and that was a point that Max and I went back and forth about with the Orlando Magic, was that there's a lot of interesting players at multiple position groups, but there isn't that one guy that you point to, especially on the offensive end. You go, that guy's the guy, right? Like Detroit has Cade Cunningham. As you mentioned, the Houston Rockets have Jalen Green. The Magic don't have that guy. And the Thunder have potentially two guys that really complement each other in the backcourt, which brings some of what you and I have talked about over the coming weeks, like how would the Thunder draft if they were left to draft at one of the guard/wing spots, for example, not one of the three bigs. So that just brings up another interesting layer of conversation. I'm really blown away that Orlando actually jumped up and got the number one pick. We're kind of reacting to this live, so it's okay that I can be caught off guard a little bit as a podcast host. Man, it's going to be really interesting to see where these top three teams go. Do you see, before we do a lottery mock draft rundown, which is essentially how this will go, is Stephen, I wanted him to come on and give how he would mock the lottery, because I want this to be a lot of his last thoughts with this 2022 NBA draft. We went through his big board. I want to leave him with a mock draft in the same way, and we will run through the lottery. But before we get to that really quick, Stephen, do you see any three of those bigs falling out of the top three and letting one of those guards jump up, in which case Sacramento has a pretty interesting player fall to them at number 4? Do you think those three bigs are going to be who goes?
I think with the teams, the way that they land, it'd be hard pressed for me to see any of the big three fall out of the top three, because we'll get into some of the names here in particular, but Orlando, I feel very strongly that they're going to get one of the big three. And then Oklahoma City, since they're drafting second, I think that they'll probably go more of the consensus route as to, there's a couple names that are kind of split for that number one pick. Houston picking third, they have an abundance of like kind of guard play. So I don't necessarily think at number 3 that they'll kind of get cute or risky here. But when we start looking at 4 on down, that's when I start thinking that some of these guards that we'll mention here in the coming moments, that's when they'll start coming in. Just based on the way that the top 3 kind of shook out, I think that the big 3 will be safe.
Is there anybody you were disappointed that didn't make the leap into the top 4? Like, I think when we answered that question, well, who's a team that you would root for to potentially jump up? When we did that lottery preview over on NoCeilingsNBA.com, I kind of wanted Portland to jump up just because of everything that's happened with them, some of the stuff with Dame. Like, I was kind of hoping that they would make a sneaky jump up and that they could possibly land one of these really interesting forwards to better complement some of the other players on their roster. Nevertheless, that didn't happen. We have a lot of New York Knicks fans, I'm sure, that are listening to this podcast in the audience. And any one team in particular you were disappointed didn't jump up?
I mean, I'm not necessarily disappointed, but when asked that question, the New Orleans Pelicans, like, they stole my heart in this postseason, because just the way that they didn't care. Like, I'm sure deep down they respect the talent that they were playing against in the Phoenix Suns, but just how young they were. They didn't have Zion. CJ McCollum is like finally away from Portland. Not that he even wanted to be away, but it was kind of an ongoing conversation of how long will Dame and CJ be on the same team. And, he's finally gone. We start seeing these young guys, TM3, a player that a lot of us at No Ceilings were really high on. Herb Jones is just one of the darlings of the season in terms of rookies. So I thought it would have been really interesting to see, off of the heels of incredible, second half of the season for them, relative incredible second half of the season, I guess I should say. And then, that kind of thrilling playoff bout that they had against the Suns. I was really kind of hoping that the momentum would just carry over and that the Pelicans would kind of vault up into that top 5 conversation.
Yeah, it would have been really interesting to see what they would have done with a top 5 pick. I think that they could have added an electric option in the backcourt, like a Jaden Ivey or even a Shane Sharp. Sure. They may still add a backcourt player, and they may still add a backcourt player in your mock which we will run through very shortly. So let's set the scene for the audience. Let's give the order in case for whatever reason they haven't seen the order by the time they're listening to this episode of the podcast. Number 1, we talked about it, the Orlando Magic. Number 2, the Oklahoma City Thunder. Number 3, the Houston Rockets. Number 4, the Sacramento Kings making that jump, which means the Detroit Pistons fell to number 5. Indiana Pacers at number 6, Portland Trail Blazers at number 7, New Orleans Pelicans at number 8, San Antonio Spurs at number 9, the Washington Wizards at number 10, and then rounding out the lottery, the New York Knicks at 11, the Clippers at 12, the Charlotte Hornets at 13, and the Cleveland Cavaliers at the back end of the lottery at 14. So, Stephen, this is your moment, my friend. We're going to count down 1 through 14. You're going to give how you would do this. We'll go pick by pick. I can sort of react to each one, give some of my thoughts. We're going to go pick by pick here. So number 1 at the top, Stephen, this is your mock draft. This is your last lottery input. Who would you take at number 1 if you were the Orlando Magic?
I'm going to cut you guys off real quick. Just for the audience sake, number 12 is actually going to be, isn't that going to be Oklahoma City, not the Clippers?
Yes, it is Oklahoma City.
You are 100% correct.
Just for the audience sake.
That's why Kevin's the best in the business.
That is why Kevin's the best in the business.
Also, Orlando does have a number 1 option. His name is Mo Bamba.
Oh my goodness.
Okay.
And just for the audience, I apologize about that blunder. We are literally going like live as we're recording this podcast. A lot's happening at once. And just one more tidbit before Stephen gives his pick, just for the audience at home. As I'm looking at our Google Sheets while we are trying to go through this mock draft exercise, I feel like I'm on an episode of SNL's Celebrity Jeopardy because I have greatest player in NBA history off to the right. And in that column, Kevin wrote Lonzo Ball because he always has to bring up Lonzo Ball in every basketball conversation we have. So that is our Sean Connery Celebrity Jeopardy moment of this podcast episode. So we made that correction. It is the Oklahoma City Thunder getting that pick from the Clippers at number 12. Thank you, Kevin, for that correction. But without further ado, Stephen, number 1, Orlando Magic. Who are you taking?
And I'm just as excited now as I was. Shout out to the entire No Ceilings crew who did a phenomenal job of previewing the draft lottery selection progress. I think I saw like over 70 viewers while we're competing with a bunch of other places trying to stream live. Our No Ceilings team did a phenomenal job. Shout out to Rucker, Corey, Metcalf, and Albert. But, seeing Orlando get the number 1 pick, Nathan, this was the one team that if they got the number 1 pick, my top player on my big board would not go there. Literally any other team gets this top pick, and my number 1 player on my big board would have went here. But because it's the Orlando Magic, because they need a top option like yesterday, Paolo Banchero is my number 1 guy because I think offensively, he's the most NBA ready. Defensively, I think that they got enough talent around him that are growing together. There's cohesion on this roster, which is good. He's in a low-key city, so he doesn't have to necessarily worry about anything happening off the court. Like in Orlando, the media availability is awesome, but it's not like playing in the Mecca. It's not like playing in LA or in the Bay or in Houston or wherever. Like you're playing in Orlando, you can focus on basketball. I just think that this is a perfect ecosystem for a Paolo Banchero to be the absolute best version of himself. That's why I have him number 1, Nathan.
I agree with you 100%. I do think it's a great fit for him in terms of some of the off-the-court reasons that you laid out. Also on the court, we said it. This team does not have a number 1 offensive option in terms of do everything yourself, go get me a bucket, completely self-created by you at that size, 6'10", 250 pounds, with what we were able to see from him at Duke, creating out of the mid-post, out of post-ups, off the dribble in isolation, even catch-and-shoot looks, the stutter rip. Every move that he brought to the table from an offensive standpoint, there are so many ways that he can score off self-generated offense, but then he gets to play off the ball at times with some of the point guards that we can talk about with Markelle Fultz and Jalen Suggs and Cole Anthony. He gets to play off of somebody like Franz Wagner, who's a secondary or tertiary playmaker within that offense. Wendell Carter is a better passer at the center position, likely than given credit for. there's ways that Paolo can take over this offense, but at the same time, he doesn't have to do every single thing himself. And for a team that finished with the 19th rated defense in the NBA per synergy, they do have some players on that roster that can maybe not fully mask or hide any of Paolo's shortcomings, at least very early in his career, but can help bring him along on that end of the floor and not make him feel like he has to do everything on the defensive side of the ball as well. I think choosing him with the number one pick, kind of inserting him in there as one of those last puzzle pieces, gives you that young core that can continue to grow together, continue to learn how to communicate, play off of one another, defend together. I think that would be an excellent fit for the Atlanta Magic. So I have no complaints with who you went with at number one. OKC, Stephen, who you going with the Thunder at number two?
My number one player on my big board here, Jabari Smith Jr. I just think that, the passes, the pick and rolls, the pick and pops that he's going to be able to run with players such as, Josh Giddey, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, the defense that he's going to bring to this team. He's not necessarily going to be the defensive identity, but he's a building block and almost a cornerstone, if you will, Nathan. I think that everything that's kind of being critiqued about him as a number one pick or a number one prospect is on the offensive end. And listen, I get it. I understand that he doesn't necessarily have a bag, but I think running off the ball, setting screens, running within the flow of the offense, working in the mid post, getting opportunities to play with guys that aren't necessarily chuckers. So he's going to be incentivized to move the ball. And then defensively, just being able to switch between any level of the defense, I think is going to be huge for Oklahoma City. They have another pick coming later, which I am thrilled with the way that this draft process laid out, because I think with the player that I have them picking later, I'm not going to drop the name. If they land both of these guys, you're talking about a very exciting young Oklahoma City Thunder that has the potential to have every type of player in a hierarchy that could equal playoff success in the coming seasons as they continue to grow and build together. So I got Jabari Smith Jr. as my number two pick, Nathan.
Not that I agreed at every point during the year when people wanted to just trash Auburn's guards that they had, when they talked about Jabari Smith and Walker Kessler. They didn't have guards who could get him the ball, or whatever they wanted to say.
That's not how I talk, Nathan. That's not how I talk.
Now, I wasn't just pointing out you, Steven. I wasn't even thinking about you when I said that comment. I was thinking about all of the social media trolls that I had to deal with over the course of the year. When you have tried to stand up for Jabari Smith, or even when I've tried to stand up for Jabari Smith, that was a very regular comment that was said, not just on social media, but on mainstream media fronts as well. That won't be an excuse anymore, though, man, because if he goes to Oklahoma City, he's got SGA and Josh Giddey who are able to get him the ball in any spot that he needs it. It limits how much self-creation he needs to do by himself. And when he doesn't have to create off the dribble, when he doesn't have to go manufacture his own offense, when he can catch the ball in the post, when he can get it at the elbow and the nail, when he can come off of screens, right, and be able to get shots up from the perimeter, he can just catch and think about scoring, whether that's going straight at the basket off a line drive and not having to go east-west, or it's shooting immediately off the catch. Jabari Smith can get the ball in the spots that he is most efficient at, that he proved that he can hit very tough shots all throughout the course of his freshman year at Auburn. And the Oklahoma City Thunder, we talked about with Topic Thunder, man, they need shot makers from all over the floor. They need offense, but they need guys who can hit open perimeter shots. There is nobody better at the top of this draft to hit open perimeter shots than Jabari Smith. So you're 2 for 2, Stephen. I agree with both of these picks so far. I'm assuming we're going to agree 3 for 3, but who knows? You always like to hit me with some kind of wild card in these podcasts. Who are you going with for the Rockets at number 3?
Nah, Nathan, I think that we're going to keep the hits coming. A player that even really early in the season, when we were talking about, and I'm talking about, the draft Twitter, the collective we here, when we were putting out favorite places for him, I would like to think I kind of led the charge on this. Chet Holmgren to Houston. I just think it fits so well, man. First off, the defense on this team is atrocious, and I'm not going to say that Chet Holmgren is going to come in and they're going to be a top 10 defense in his rookie season. But what I am going to say, Nathan, is that you're drafting a defensive anchor. You have the electric offensive talent that you wanted last year. You got a big who can play make and is showing flashes of creation. Now you're drafting a big who can you can funnel things towards him, and you can trust that, Nathan, I call him the Venus flytrap. As much as people
Yes,
think, as much as people think that they were going to get away with stuff in college, I can't wait to see Chet Holmgren completely surprise NBA level athletes with like, okay, bud, like I saw the college highlights. That was cute, but you're in the big leagues now. Let me try to take you to task. And one of the favorite comments I've heard about Chet Holmgren all season long, I think, was from our good friend Chuck from Chucking Darts, was that he's still going to be as tall as he is in the NBA. I think that sometimes we just think that guys are going to shrink when they move up a level. He's still going to be just as tall and long in the NBA as he was in college, and that's going to create a lot of problems for offenses that aren't ready to deal with that type of length. And not to mention, Nathan, you're much higher on the offense than I am. But here's the thing. In Houston, he's going to be able to move the ball. The high lows between him and Şengün are going to be must watch. The cutting with guys like Jacob, I think, is going to be much watch. The two-man action between him and Green or, Porter Jr., I think is just going to be tremendous. Dashian Nix has earned a spot on this roster. I think some pick and roll, pick and pop sets between them would even be fun. So with everything that Houston has going on right now, throwing Chet Holmgren into the mix, I just think is going to make them one of the must-watch G League teams in the league next season.
G League teams?
Or excuse me, League Pass teams, excuse me.
I was going to say, I thought we were just ripping the Houston Rockets there for a second. Good
no,
gosh,
no. Shout out to all the Houston Rockets fans that have put me in there.
It's not impossible for Chet Holmgren to end up on the Rio Grande Valley Vipers, but I would expect him to be with the Houston Rockets for the majority of the year, and I would agree with you that even though they might not be one of the best basketball teams in the NBA, they are going to be a League Pass darling, as they're
going to be so much fun. Thank you.
As they were this past year, man. No worries. We are literally firing from the hip on this podcast. I already had my one blunder. All right, it's only natural that you got to get one blunder in.
I was doing so good up until the end. I'm so sorry, Houston Rockets, but I hope that you got the gist of what I was saying. Like, Chet Holmgren on Houston is just going to be much watched, League Pass basketball.
So I don't need to go in depth on an evaluation on Chet Holmgren. I do just want to say one thing is that this whole notion that's been bubbling over on social media about how Chet Holmgren can't average 20 plus points per game, I still think that's comical, because the dude averaged 14.1 points per game at Gonzaga, quite literally feeding off of the scraps of everyone else. Like, a lot of his offense was completely manufactured for him in terms of he was basically viewed as a play finisher, whether that was easy dump off passes around the basket or trailer 3-point shots. And then you factor in some of the offensive rebounding, some of the putbacks he was able to get. He was a play finisher at Gonzaga. And I loved when he came on NBA Today on ESPN and they asked him, what is something that you're going to be able to do in the NBA that you didn't get to show all of at the college level? And he said, create my own shot, create my own offense. I 100% agree with him, Stephen. You know that I've sat here on this podcast and I've said, I really wonder what would have happened if Chet could have caught the ball in some of the same spots that Paolo and Jabari did on their respective teams. What more of the offense could have Chet shown at Gonzaga? And we saw very, very many flashes of Chet being used out of some of the same spots at Gonzaga when you compare it to the other two players. When he did catch the ball at the elbow, for example, I mean, this is a guy, you mentioned his height and his length, Steve. He can shoot over anybody. And that jump shot's not going to go away. It's only going to get better. And then as he continues to fill out, get stronger, when he does take the ball and he rips it, he goes off the drive, like, you won't be able to knock him off of his spots in the same way that you can right now, like 2 to 3 years down the road. So I just think just the skill that he already has, his comfort level, shooting the ball from the perimeter, handling the basketball on the break, you'll be able to translate more of that into the half court as his body continues to fill out. Then you get everything you mentioned with the defense. I still think he's the number one player in the draft. It would not shock me if this was the order that honestly happened on draft night. That's why I will say we're 3 for 3 in agreement. It would not shock me if this is how it ended up. I think I would still take Chet Holmgren at number 1, but that's just because of how high on him I am, despite the Paolo fit. But this could very well be a great summary of what happens on draft night. So we will move past those top 3 guys. So those are pretty much the consensus top 3 guys on any big board you want to look at. the draft, as they say, can really begin at number 4, where I think the majority of buzz over the last few weeks is this would be between Jaden Ivey and Shaedon Sharpe. And I'm very curious if you go with one of those two players, Stephen, or if you introduce another name into the mix. But Sacramento jumps up. I don't know if they have a need in the backcourt per se, but what is the argument I personally made to you? We talked about this with the Thunder.
BPA, baby.
Same thing with the Kings. BPA, Stephen. So who are you going with for the Sacramento Kings at number 4?
And to me, like, it's neck and neck for BPA, but Sacramento getting the 4th pick is a home run. So why not go for a home run swing? Like, let's just take Shaedon Sharpe here. I think that Sacramento, like, I would not be mad if they went Ivy, but I mean, you're talking about, having a guy like Davion Mitchell on this team. Dante DiVincenzo may or may not continue to be on this team. There's just so much that they can do in the backcourt, but adding Shaedon Sharpe gives you legitimate wing size. Probably going to start off playing a lot of 2 in the NBA, but who knows if he develops and gets his strength up.
That was the point that I would bring up, is that we saw Sacramento still take Davion Mitchell and be comfortable wanting to run and experiment with these 3-guard lineups between Fox, Halliburton, and Davion Mitchell. Well, if you introduce Shaedon Sharpe into the equation, he's 6'6" with length. Like he's not suited physically to play the 3 yet, but could eventually become a guy who maybe at least in stretches during NBA games, you're throwing him in the 3 with his other 2 guards on the floor. Now you're talking about that much athletic pop on the floor at once could be a scary proposition, especially in transition for other teams.
Yeah, and Nathan, you and I both discussed that, like, we think that we know everything right now as far as like how these players are going to play out. Nathan, there's a shout out to Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Like, there's a universe out there, Nathan, where Shaedon Sharpe could be the best player in this entire draft class. I mean, and if we look at how impactful wings are, or, just tremendous guards with creation ability, like, that's what's dominating the playoffs right now. It's not the big man, like, they dominate the regular season, but there's players like Shaedon Sharpe in the playoffs right now, Nathan, that are cooking. Or have had their teams advance significantly, deep into the playoffs. So adding a player like this who is just electric offensively, a guy who projects to be able to score at least at 2 levels, maybe initially. We'll see if he can work on that mid-range ability. And then defensively, I mean, I worry about defense as a whole in Sacramento. And if you're drafting Shaedon Sharpe to play defense, bless your heart. But I just think that playing off of Sabonis also is another interesting wrinkle, a player who can get tremendous looks for his guards. I mean, we talk about Nikola Jokic and how tremendous he is at getting players open. I think that just a step down, Domantas Sabonis is one of the best passing bigs in the entire league. So it'll be interesting to see how Shaedon Sharpe could play off of guys like De'Aaron Fox. And then on the opposite side of the floor, you got Domantas Sabonis. So, Rashawn Holmes, will he stay there? I don't know. But, I mean, the Sacramento Kings getting Shaedon Sharpe, I think, would be kind of like a beacon of hope for the future of this team.
4 for 4, Stephen. I think that was the right pick to make for the Kings. And regardless of how those other top 3 guys play out in the order on draft night, I fully expect the Kings to take Shaedon Sharpe at number 4. That seems like a very Kings pick to me, but for once it could actually be the right pick for the franchise moving forward, given the long-term upside. So Detroit Pistons at number 5. Stephen, you can go the direction that was actually predicted the team would go months ago. Like, we listened to Chad Ford at one point on multiple podcast fronts report from his sources within front offices that Jaden Ivey was going to be a target of the Detroit Pistons, that they loved pairing him, the idea of pairing him with Cade Cunningham to create one of the most young and dynamic backcourts, potentially a prolific backcourt combination when you factor in how they can play off of one another in the NBA. And when Chad was making those comments, it made all of us kind of perk our ears up a little bit, because that was when Detroit could have had like the number 2 pick, or even go potentially at number 1, for example, when he was doing some of those mock drafts, and like he would still put Jaden Ivey to the Pistons in those mocks. So Do you have the Pistons in your lottery mock, Stephen, getting that guy, or should I say possibly getting their guy, just given the intel?
Yeah, Nathan, I think that, well, for one, in terms of my big board, the way that I've done my mock so far has gone player 2, then 1, then 3, then 4, and it's going to continue on with number 5 here for Detroit. I am going to do BPA. I'm going to take Jaden Ivey here. And I just think that, Detroit, when I listen to guys like, Coach Bryce Simon, over at Motor City Hoops, great friend of both of us and friend of the show here. The two things that he said that they needed is they needed a big, and at 5, I'm kind of hesitant to give them one, or they needed a boost in athleticism. So right now, Jaden Ivey would be the second part of that, the answer to the athleticism factor. Cade has that old man game that I constantly refer to where like the game just kind of happens around him. It happens at his speed. And even as a rookie, like you can see that he's going to grow into a player that doesn't get shook all that often on the offensive side of the ball. Having a guy who can cut off of a playmaker, we saw that this season at Purdue. Having a guy that it projects to be a legitimate threat from deep, at least respectable, and a guy who could also help you out with playmaking responsibilities too. So you get a second banana to Cade Cunningham here at number 5. I don't think that falling to 5 is a kiss of death to Detroit, even though we were just like, oh man, really, like this happened to Detroit? Because as much as some people think that after the first pick or maybe the top 3 that this draft really falls off, I still think top 5, Nathan. I don't see that vast of a difference 1 through 5. Like there is another one of these universes out there where Ivy is the number 1 prospect in this class, even though we think that it's one of the big 3.
Jaden Ivey can play off of all the talent that the Detroit Pistons already have in place. He can also take point guard reps next to Cade Cunningham, or they could bring him off the bench, or even if they start him, leave him in the game with the majority of the second unit and give him point guard reps against other backup NBA units to give him more experience in that type of a role. I would be very, very curious to see what happens with Killian Hayes. If this is the selection of Jaden Ivey, because that was, we talked about with Bryce, that was the backcourt that Pistons fans envisioned. When they drafted Cade Cunningham, you expected Killian and Cade to be able to play off of one another. And to certain degrees, they complement each other. But as we talked about it, like Killian's much better when he has guys who are immediately threats to either catch and shoot the basketball or cut with some of that space that's created and get to the basket and be able to finish those types of plays, those baseline cuts, things of that nature. Cade is not doing really either of those things, at least at a high level during his rookie year. So kind of by default, you're sort of playing 2 players next to one another who don't fully complement each other, at least not at this point in their careers. Ivy, it's a whole different story because Ivy completely plays very well off the ball with what he can do next to a Cade Cunningham. And I think that Ivy will be able to leverage the offense in his favor with Cade on the floor, but also, like I said, be able to run the second unit, be that type of a guard, and get reps in both areas. And I think just having the both of them on the floor puts the defense in a bind, because on one hand with Cade, you have one of the more talented shot makers that we have, who's come into the NBA and now will look to further establish himself in year 2. And then you have Jaden Ivey, who, as you talked about, Stephen, he is an athletic blur. In transition as well as in the half court. If he gets downhill going right, he's nearly impossible to keep in front of. So that could be one of the more dynamic backcourts in the NBA. And I would agree with the sentiment that is not a consolation prize in the slightest. I would have Jaden Ivey still. I've gone back and forth, man. I've gone back and forth with having him or Shaden at that 4 spot. I've come back around to having Ivey.
It's nip tuck
at that 4 spot. So I think the Pistons would get a massive win here with Ivy at number 5. So now it could get really interesting with the Indiana Pacers at number 6. There's a player on the board who we've talked about in No Ceilings would be an excellent fit with what they've already established in a young team in Indiana. But maybe you go another direction. Who are you going at number 6?
Yeah, this is where I think that, Nathan, it was a fun ride, dude. I think that we went 5 for 5 there. This is where you start getting to boards at No Ceilings and you're just like, okay, this is why we're a collective, because we view the games through different, prisms or, through different perspectives. And I got to go with my BPA, dude. Like, I'm sticking with your philosophy here. The best player left on my board to go into Indiana, Dyson Daniels. And when I think about him and Halliburton in a backcourt together, oh my goodness. Like, you're getting two kind of jumbo playmakers that see the game very well, very instinctual passers. But with Dyson, you're getting a connector, right? Like, you're getting a guy who can play off of him, who can play with the ball in his hand. You're getting a guy who could probably, even as he bulks up, give you a little bit of minutes at the three, which would be huge for Indiana, because I mean, that's kind of where the team is lacking, is a little bit at that forward spot. And you still got Miles Turner potentially. I don't know. He's rumored to be traded every offseason. And then Jaylen Smith had a great season in Phoenix, and maybe he continues that in Indiana. I mean, there's still some, Mr. Jackson in Indiana is looking good as well. So they got a good stable of big men there, even though they just traded Sabonis. Let's keep the guard play going, man. And a guy who could potentially even play the three there, TJ Warren, I don't know how he's going to look if he plays for them anymore. So I'm going to get the guy who could play really good defense, like one of the best perimeter defenders, if not the, in this draft class, and then a guy who improved as a jump shooter and is a good playmaker too. I just think that he works there.
I'm assuming you're in the same camp as Maxwell when he talked about how there's still upside with some of Dyson Daniels' shot.
Oh yeah.
I'm assuming you're buying into that as well, because if you weren't buying into some of that same upside, the argument could be made that him and Halliburton are maybe two similar players, right? So that might be a potential collision in the backcourt. But if you envision Dyson also becoming more of a shot maker than he is right now and further growing into his offensive game, similar to how even Halliburton has, right, in his first few years in the NBA, like, I'm assuming you see that same evolution, that they can better complement each other regardless of who has the ball in their hands.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Halliburton, he's shown that he is a for real NBA shooter from deep, right? So both of these guys, as what we saw, shout out to our friends at Instat, the latter portions of the G League season, where, it looked like Dyson actually made changes to his shooting motion and timing, and the shot looked pretty. And it wasn't just off of, standstill shots. There was a few step backs in his bag too. So I think having two jumbo playmakers, I see your point, right? Like, I get the fact that, like, they're both kind of dribble pass shoot guys, but I think that you can't have too many of those guys. And plus the value that he brings defensively, whereas
the defense is really the biggest thing to call out. He would give them a legitimate defensive weapon on the perimeter.
Which helps with Halliburton, because as great as a defender as he was in college, we're not necessarily seeing it to that level at the NBA, but maybe his just offensive role is just too big, right? So I think having a guy who can kind of help him take possessions off and kind of help him catch his breath and help run sets through him as well, I think that actually helps Halliburton and makes him a more threatening player. And again, both of these guys at their best versions of themselves, they're going to be able to shoot off of one another too. So it just spaces the floor, and it makes Indiana a threat from multiple angles on the court, in my opinion.
Portland at 7. I have one name in mind where I think you're going to go. I don't know if that's what you're going to do. What would you do with the Trailblazers picking number 7?
Yeah, probably my second man crush in this draft class.
Boy. Yep.
If we're going in numerical order, and Nathan, I think that you're right. Benedict Mathurin, I think, is just a fantastic fit. A guy who's measured at about 6'6", 6'7", might be a little smaller, but we'll see here very soon with the combine measurements coming out. A guy who just is a tough shot maker, and I don't mean that to say that like he only takes tough shots. I mean that to say that he's tough, and he is a shot maker. He's NBA built already. He's very kind of just muscularly assembled, and then on top of that, he can run off of screens, hit dynamic shots coming off of movement. He improved as a playmaker with the ball in his hand. Luckily, if you look at Portland, they still have Damian Lillard, so that's not necessarily going to be asked of him. But I do imagine Portland asking him to be like, hey, man, like, can we see what you do a little bit with some shot creation? Who knows what's going to happen with their big man rotation? Yusuf Nurkic might be out the door. They have some young, interesting pieces. So I think that Mathurin will get a little bit of room to grow. But I love his defensive ability. He's far more athletically talented than he gets credit for. There's a number of times watching him play at Arizona where I saw him climb a ladder to reject a shot from behind. Very competitive on the glass too. I think that he kind of fits that Portland mindset where it's us against the world. I could definitely see him and Damian Lillard, hitting it off, doing post-game interviews with one another, having videos of them in the gym just shooting all day. Like, I just think that he fits that Portland mold and mindset, and he does fill a positional need, in my opinion.
One of the things that was Portland's downfall for a number of years, right, was relying too much on the small backcourt pairing.
Yeah.
And Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum. You, in theory, still have that small pairing with Dame and Anthony Simons, with what Simons has become. But bringing in Mathurin, who I would project him right now, at least, as more of a 2 than a 3. That Mathurin gives you that option to be able to go with a bigger player at that 2-guard spot who can play off of Dame in every aspect that you talked about. He was an excellent cutter in college. We know he's going to be able to hit wide open shots, lob threat along the baseline, transition player, plays really hard. Isn't one of the best defenders per se in this draft class, but because of how hard he competes, he can still offer value within certain team schemes. So yeah, I don't know if I personally would go Mathurin at number 7 just based off of my board, but I get why you're going there, and I do get the fit, right? I think it is a good fit for Mathurin and the Blazers, so I won't knock the pick there at number 7. So let's move to number 8, the New Orleans Pelicans. I know who I would go with at this number 8 spot, and that player has not been selected yet. I would love for a certain someone to end up with this particular Pelicans team. I don't know where you're going to go, but where would you go with the number 8 pick?
Well, let me just lead off by saying that, again, I have gone in order 1 through 7 so far on my big board. I have gone 2, 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm keeping the BPA train rolling. I am going to take Jonathan Davis to the New Orleans Pelicans.
That is exactly who I would love to end up in a Pelicans uniform at this point.
And here's the thing. He's been compared by Corey Tulaba. Shout out to Corey. He's one of the best in the business. I'm glad that I'm on his team. He's compared him to Brandon Ingram. And at first I was kind of hesitant.
Brandon Roy.
No, he's compared him to like a smaller Brandon Ingram.
I have not heard Corey say those words, but that is interesting to say the least.
It's either him or Ryan Rollins. Excuse me, I could be mixing those two up, but I see Ryan Rollins and Jonathan Davis in a lot of the same light. So maybe if he is talking about it in Ryan Rollins, I do see a lot of that similarity within Jonathan Davis. So putting him on a team with Brandon Ingram, I love that pairing. I have compared Jonathan Davis to a Brandon Roy, and I just think that the maturity to his game, I think that he fits the Pelicans very well, because even though he was the star at Wisconsin, like, he was just a garbage man on that team. Like, literally anything that needed to be done, he did it with a smile on his face. The fact that he played in the NCAA tournament injured when he could have hurt his draft stock like severely, but he loves basketball that much. I've affectionately referred to Jonathan Davis as Johnny Basketball, because to me, he encompasses everything that you should love about the game of basketball. He's not positionally versatile, but I think on New Orleans, they have the length at the wings, the forwards, and, shout out to Valanciunas at the 5. Like, they have versatility in the front court to where you can draft a guy who's a 6'4" shooting guard, maybe 6'5", depending on who's measuring him that day, I guess. But, kind of a smaller guard, not the most efficient, but I think that injuries and just simply being the only person on the team that can make a contested bucket really hurt his efficiency numbers. The lack of talent around him at Wisconsin really hurt his assist numbers, but he competes at every single aspect of the game of basketball. And again, big fan of what New Orleans did in the postseason. They're scrappy. They're in your face. They're gritty. They're a bring your lunch pail to work type team. There's not another player in the draft that exemplifies that more so than Johnny Basketball.
You were an avid listener of this podcast before you became a co-host, Stephen. What
Yes,
was the number one thing that held me back with giving the Pelicans too much credit in terms of moving up in the West standings before the year started? It was the fact that I couldn't see anybody in that backcourt playing even good perimeter defense, right? Like good perimeter point of attack defense. I couldn't see one person who could do that. Now, Alvarado, to their credit, has really emerged as somebody, and his game has actually been able to translate, at least on the defensive end, to the NBA setting. But outside of him, who else is really giving you that in the backcourt? Johnny Davis would. You're right. And for all the offense, for everything I love about McCollum offensively, it is not McCollum. Johnny Davis would give that immediately. And you're talking about a team, especially when Zion comes back, with Brandon Ingram, with McCollum, Davis could be like a fourth option offensively.
Scary.
On that team. Not having to be the number one guy, being able to take advantage of everything that he showed he was more than capable of off the ball.
More than
Wisconsin.
willing.
More than willing and more than capable. Like his lowest ranked play type on Synergy for the year was isolation scoring. That one-on-one ability. A lot of people had questions about it, but I still think it will be better in time in the NBA. I think there's still more to be unlocked those one-on-one game. But even if there isn't, even if this is the Johnny Davis we get for his NBA career with just slightly improved efficiencies in certain areas over the course of his career, if this is the player that we're going to get, that's one hell of a player for the Pelicans to have in that lineup to be able to play off of all of the other do-it-yourself bucket getters in the lineup. I think that is a home run fit for the New Orleans Pelicans, despite somebody falling in this mock draft who I personally would not let fall. Even despite that, I think the Johnny Davis fit is too good to pass up at number 8. So I agree with you on that one. Number 9, do the San Antonio Spurs, Stephen, draft the most Spurs player in this draft? Or do you have them going another direction? Who would you go with number 9?
Well, I don't know what you would classify as the most Spurs player. There's a contingent of people that think that's an international guy. There's a contingent of people that just think, as like batting a single guy. I'm going to go with my best player available, which I know that you'll respect. I'm gonna go Malachi Branham here. I'm gonna go Malachi for San Antonio.
Man, what did Keegan Murray do to you, man? Seriously, like I know we've talked about him on your big board and where you have him ranked. You don't have him as a top 10 guy. Like what did Keegan Murray do to you, man?
He didn't do anything to me, but I'll tell you what Malachi Branham did for me. Okay, yep. Malachi Branham came into the season. People knew about him, right? But he wasn't projected to be what we saw now. And if you look at what San Antonio is doing, could they use forward help? Absolutely. They got Vassell.
They can take a big. They could take Jaylen Durant, who we've mocked in multiple scenarios in those ceilings.
Absolutely. And I love Durant. I love him so much. But to me, if you're San Antonio and you watched, a team that was vying for the playoffs, Nathan, what was the one thing that they needed on this team? They needed somebody else other than Dejounte Murray who could do anything with a ball in their hand. And Dejounte Murray, as talented as he is, the triple doubles that he's posted, as talented as a defender as he is too. And Josh Primo is shown a lot, right? Like he's proved a lot of the naysayers wrong in terms of just flashes. Like he's still a little bit of a way, but he looks more real than he did whenever he was drafted that night. So Malachi Branham comes in, has a very mature game, can help alleviate the pressure off of Dejounte Murray, can help the San Antonio Spurs have another shot creator, have a legit shooter from deep, and can really just help run multiple units on this team and give them a little bit more versatility. Having Murray or Dejounte Murray and then having Malachi Branham, there's really not a weakness on either side of the ball. Whereas like you can put Dejounte Murray on the more difficult guard matchup and then you have Branham helping out. But then on the opposite side of the ball, you have two legitimate ball handlers and scoring threats. So I think that helps San Antonio more long-term as we watch Vassell and as we watch Primo grow in to larger roles. And look, Jakob Poeltl, he's not a star, but I mean, he's shown that he can kind of hold up his own. So when I'm looking at who could be taken here for San Antonio, I'm getting Dejounte Murray some help as a shot creator.
I have Malachi Branham as a top 10 player, regardless of if I maybe thought that there could have been a few better fits there at that spot. I can't knock the Branham argument of taking him in the top 10. At the end of the day, having a weapon on your team who at any point offensively can just go for 20 to 30 points on any given night if you were not paying attention to him. If he's the fourth or fifth option on your team and you're telling me that's the kind of offensive threat that you can deploy at any given moment, that is a luxury for NBA teams to have. And I think as long as he does what he needs to do and show what he needs to show during workouts, during interviews with teams, I would fully expect him to be a lottery pick at this point, and it would not shock me if he goes top 10, like you and I would have him ranked on our big boards at this point. It's not just us. There's a bunch of people at this point, I think, who have him, top 10, respected names in this field. So I like the Brandon pick in the top 10. So,
and don't get too sad, because the name that everybody is probably and look, I'm not just like trying to be contrarian just to be cool. Like, this is honestly how I evaluate the guys. And Nathan, if I can just lead off, because I feel like I'm getting
just go for it. Washington Wizards at number 10. Go for it.
Washington Wizards at number 10. And just to let you know, like, how much I like this pick for them, I deviated from my best player available. Keegan Murray isn't even my 10th best guy on my board right now, but I like the pick for Washington because I think that playing alongside Kristaps Porzingis, low key, I think is actually really nice for KP, right? Like, he's getting more help as a weak side rim protector for Keegan Murray. He's getting another guy who can bang in the paint and like has no problem doing that. That puts Kristaps Porzingis in more, optimal roles for his sake. And then it gives Bradley Beal another pick and roll option. So I like the weak side rim protection that he brings on this team, the rebounding, the post playmaking, the fact that he and Kristaps Porzingis could probably run some unique 4-5, high-low action, maybe even some pick and roll sets, because Keegan Murray does have a little bit of handle to his game. And I think that it makes the Washington Wizards front court a little bit more versatile, right? Like, the New York Knicks largely get criticized because they run an archaic system where their one can only play the one, the two, and so on and so forth. The Washington Wizards are kind of similar in that aspect, but I think introducing Keegan Murray here for this team as a 10th pick, it modernizes their roster. It helps out Kristaps Porzingis be his best self. And then it gives Bradley Beal another guy that he can run some sets with as well. So I got Keegan Murray here at number 10, Nathan, despite him not being 10th on my board.
No complaints for me with this pick. I mean, Keegan Murray, this is another guy we talk about. Is he a number one or even a number two option within an NBA offense, or is he just going to be a guy who is probably best suited as a number three, but is just a really damn good NBA player? That's what he would get to be with this current Washington Wizards roster construction right now, where you still likely are bringing back Bradley Beal. We try to speculate all these trades with Bradley Beal, but just like Dame, he doesn't seem to want to go anywhere. So he's probably going to sign that contract and be back with the Washington Wizards. You have Kristaps Porzingis, who you just traded for, who can be a number two option. You have Keegan Murray in the fold, who, hell, some nights he doesn't even have to be number three. Like, Kyle Kuzma's still on that team. Kyle Kuzma still wants to get his shots up. Keegan can be like a fourth option some nights, depending on the lineup. And a guy who just checks so many boxes, who's one of the smartest players at seeing the floor and understanding what's going on both sides of the ball in this draft class. He's a very sure thing that the Wizards would be able to get in number 10. That, in my opinion, would be tremendous value for them at that pick. New York Knicks at number 11.
Yes.
Clicks for Knicks, baby. Who are you? who are you giving the Knicks at number 11?
Nathan, I got all the way down to 11 whenever we finished watching the draft order. And again, shout out to the guys at No Ceilings NBA on their YouTube channel, No Ceilings TV, where the guys they did a tremendous job, right? I had a hard time with the Knicks because, listen, I listened to CP come on the Draft Act podcast with Corey and Rucker, and the biggest thing that Corey talks about, and again, shout out to Corey, he's the GOAT. He talks about modernizing this roster. And I think the one player that's left that, if everything checks out and goes according to plan, could yield top 5 value, but there are legit concerns about him.
I know where you're going.
I hope so. I let in pretty hard with that. But AJ Griffin at 11 to the New York Knicks. For one, I mean, he spaces the floor, something that the Knicks desperately need. Like, even if his medicals aren't like A plus, he still spaces the floor. His defense, in theory, at the next level, looks like it'll check out. He's not a selfish guy. He can run point of attack defense. He rebounds well. We haven't really got to see him do much with the ball in his hand. I don't know if Coach Tibbs is going to be the type of guy to give him that type of experimental development. But I think a 3-and-D player who has the potential to be a top 5 player in this draft class if everything checks out. I think getting that guy at 11 for a Knicks team that desperately needs like a glimmer of hope after the season that they had, I think it makes a lot of sense here at 11, Nathan.
I definitely think Knicks fans would love the pick. There's no reason for them not to love the pick. We're talking about bringing one of New York's own home. And as you mentioned,
he was my best available too. He was my 10th best prospect, and they're getting him here at 11.
With the upside factor, if he is everything that he needs to be, clean slate of health, you are talking about somebody who at one point, especially preseason, Stephen, I mean, I had him in that top 5, top 6 conversation. He was one of the very first players that I talked about on the Draft Deeper podcast for the 2022 draft cycle. That is how highly regarded he was to Tyler Rucker and I when we did that podcast episode. So I think at 11, given the situation, given the type of player that he is, he seems to be a very high character guy off the court. Those are the types of personalities you want to bring into the New York market, plus all the upside at the wing position. I agree with you. I think that would be a good swing for the Knicks to take, even if some of these other teams in the top 10 of the lottery are a little hesitant because of some of the medical stuff that could come back. If the medicals are good enough, right, and they give you optimism for everything moving forward, even if the rookie year could possibly be a little shaky. We've seen that happen with some of these star players too, who end up being more in the NBA than based on what their first year, even their first or second years looked like in the NBA. If everything can check out and move in an optimistic direction, I think AJ Griffin could be a fine target for the New York Knicks. And again, I don't think fans would be mad at that pick at all. So number 12, we're back on the board again. Oklahoma City Thunder. Jabari Smith was the pick at number 2. I think I know where you're going. And if you're going here, this could be a massive, massive home run draft for the Oklahoma City Thunder when we're talking about value. Who you going with at number 12?
Yeah, I mean, the guy who I have 11th on my board, I've had as high as, I believe, 5 at one point. I really love his fit on this team, and he addresses a major need that this team would still have after they draft Jabari Smith Jr. That's a guy who can roll to the basket. That's a guy who can defend the rim. I like him to be able to switch on the perimeter a lot. I don't think that has been discussed enough. He's got tremendous upside as a post playmaker, which is dangerous considering the playmakers that this team already has on their roster. Nathan, I'm going Jaylen Durant out of Memphis. I like him a lot on this team. A legit lob threat for the dynamic playmaking guards that they have. He'll have great floor spacing with those said players, and then adding Jabari Smith Jr. Now you have a modernized NBA roster that could, if everything works out correctly, and as I suspect it should, this is a team that might be on the come up quickly in the Western Conference based on the age of some of these other rosters and the defense that this front court would add to the playmaking of the backcourt. Nathan, I would, if I'm Oklahoma City and I walk away with that haul, like, that's an A+ draft in my opinion.
I would also agree with you. It would be an A+ draft. How crazy would that be, right, Stephen? When we talk about the types of questions that you and I both got leading up to the draft lottery, when Oklahoma City Thunder fans, when we've been on certain podcasts, they've kind of asked us, what are our thoughts about if they got the number 4 and the number 12 picks, right? Like, who are the two targets? And the fact that we went from, in those scenarios, Shane Sharp and potentially somebody like Ousmane Dieng, for example, and now we move to Jabari Smith and Jaylen Durant, two guys who give
holy smokes
incredible long-term upside, but are also fits with how this roster is currently constructed. We're talking about the potential rare home run of the best of both worlds, BPA as well as fit. I could not disagree with what you've done here. I think if that's actually how it played out on draft night for the Oklahoma City Thunder, they could possibly jump the league pass rankings in terms of I think the Rockets are still going to be my league pass team going into next year, and I will want to see what Cade does in year 2 for Detroit. But man, if that's the draft that the Thunder have, holy smokes, that would be something. I would absolutely love for that to be the outcome.
You're talking about guys with the upside positionally to be like in the top half of the league at their position. Like realistically could very well happen on a team that could also like be in conversations for Victor Wembanyama or Scoot next year.
So let's finish out these last 2 picks, and then we have one more segment that we want to get to tonight on this pod. So Charlotte Hornets at number 13. There is an obvious pick to be made on the board, Stephen. I don't know.
There is.
But what are you doing for them at 13?
I'm not going to go with the obvious pick because they have the 15th pick. And I think that there's a player that they could take now that probably won't be there at 15. I'm going to go Jeremy Suhan here as a guy who can help this like horrible defense, as a guy who can make a little bit at the 4. He might give you minutes at the 3. He might give you minutes at the 5, but I project him long-term, Nathan, being a mainstay at the 4. Doesn't really shoot well, but I love his creativity, man. I love the flair that he plays with. I love the toughness, the grit. The defense is obviously going to be his calling card. And I think, pick and roll sets with him. And then we're not going to talk about the 15th pick, but that's where I would probably take Mark Williams if I'm them. But I don't think that Jeremy Suhan is going to be available at 15, where Mark Williams, like, realistically could be available that far down.
And then the Cleveland Cavaliers at number 14, who you give in Cleveland, a team that is on the doorstep to do some damage in the playoffs with real legitimate talent. Do you still give them a quote-unquote upside guy, or do you maybe go with a little bit more of someone who's quote-unquote viewed as like a finished product, for example? Who you go with at 14?
How about the best of both worlds, Nathan? And you thought that you were going to get a draft lottery without me mentioning one of my favorite players in this entire draft.
Oh, boy.
Tari Eason, 14 for the Cleveland Cavaliers, as a guy who can help this like funky defensive-minded front court. Also grew as a three-point shooter. Also underlying passing skill set that's just waiting to be unleashed in the NBA. Just all around tough, hardworking dude. I think fits this Cleveland Cavalier culture, their identity to an absolute freaking T. I think that there's so much in his game that would fit beautifully to Cleveland. And because I'm not a homer, like I do have him here at 14, but I honestly feel like, Nathan, that his fit with this Cleveland Cavaliers roster is one of the best fits when you start to get around this like outside the top 10 window.
You didn't go with your boy Ochai Agbaji. I'm a little shocked. I think that would have probably been my pick, just thinking off the top, like we're firing from the hip for this mock draft, but I respect it. I respect the different opinion. I do think Tari is in play to be drafted in the lottery, so I don't think that's unrealistic in the slightest. Some interesting directions you took at the very tail end of the mock draft, but just to recap for the audience, Steven's lottery mock draft right after the draft lottery was done and the picks were revealed. Number 1, Orlando Magic, Paolo Banchero. Number 2, Oklahoma City Thunder, Jabari Smith Jr. Number 3, Houston Rockets, Chet Holmgren. 4, Sacramento Kings, Shane Sharp. At pick number 5, Detroit Pistons slide to 5. They get Jay Ivey in this scenario. And number 6, the Pacers get Dyson Daniels. At number 7, the Blazers get Benedict Mathurin. And number 8, the Pelicans get Johnny Davis. At number 9, the Spurs get Malachi Branham. At number 10, the Wizards get Keegan Murray. At number 11, the Knicks get AJ Griffin. At number 12, the Oklahoma City Thunder get Jaylen Durant. 13, the Hornets get Jeremy Suhan. And number 14, the Cleveland Cavaliers, we finish off with Tari Eason at number 14. One hell of a mock draft, Stephen. I applaud you for not a lot of time that you technically put into this, because we are firing from the hip doing this pretty live, but I can tell a lot of thought has gone into your evaluations on these players and where they could possibly fall on draft night. You've done a tremendous job for us in No Ceilings and here on Draft Deeper throughout the course of this 2022 cycle, Stephen. I'm so proud of the effort that you put in, your willingness to come in and do literally anything that needed to be done, jumping in, helping me co-host the show, whether you're in the rotation, out of the rotation, regardless, you showed up and you absolutely knocked it out of the park. I couldn't have been more happy and more thrilled to have you as a co-host right now, Stephen. And when you are back for the next draft cycle, we will certainly have you in the rotation here at Draft Deeper, right where you need to be. So, because you are a member of Draft Deeper, as you'll always be a member of Draft Deeper, I can't have you exit stage left and not have you give your guys for the 2022 NBA draft cycle. We will not go in depth. We're not going to have full-blown discussions on these guys.
No,
but
we talked about a good bit of them already.
You need to give me your guys for this cycle. Just give me brief explanations on why they're your guys to close out this podcast on a high note.
Well, we'll start out, Nathan. Thank you for the beautiful introduction. I'm going to give more thoughts on everything that you laid out here at the end of the show. But for the My Guys segment, Dyson Daniels quickly has risen to be one of my guys. I think that I was obligated to put him here after some of the behind the scenes conversations that took place in our No Ceilings boardroom. So, or war room rather, I should say. Dyson Daniels, I have him as my sixth best prospect. Everything that I mentioned about why I think that Pacers should take him applies there. Benedict Mathurin, my ultimate man crush in this year's draft cycle. I know I'm not alone. Shout out to Rucker. He and I are definitely team Mathurin. I have him number 7 on my board. I just love, I felt like people were just ignoring what was actually taking place in the season. And then once the season died and people went back and watched this film, they're like, oh yeah, he actually kind of did all these things. And I was just like screaming the entire season, like, yeah, of course. Like he did those things, but another one of my guys. And then we talked about Torrey Eason at the tail end of the lottery. Just ultimate working class prospect that I think is going to find a long staying home in the NBA. But 2 players, Nathan, that we didn't get a chance to talk about this podcast, but people have definitely heard me bring them up. My 26th prospect on my board, Nathan, is Ishmael Kamagate. Just the talent that he plays with in the paint. I think that he does have more moves than he's getting credit for on the offensive side of the ball. And a lot of the games that I've seen, he does offer some pretty clean counters to his initial move that I think that catches the defense off guard. And then defensively, like just not afraid to contest the basket by any means necessary. Came to the game late. I think that there's a lot still left to unearth in his game, but I'm a really big fan of him. And then my final guy, Nathan, Vince Williams Jr. out of VCU, a guy who I wasn't necessarily turned on to until about the March timeframe. So I know I'm later to the party than some, but I just love his versatility. The playmaking that he has, legitimately one of the best passers in this class. I think positionally in the NBA, if he catches on, that'll be something that's emphasized with his game. The defensive versatility that he has. And oh yeah, by the way, he can knock down an open jump shot. I liken him to, your Jay Crowders, your Mikal Bridges, or not Mikal Bridges, your Torrey Craigs of the world, guys who playoff teams want, and they're not necessarily, featured on a lot of your teams, but you win games when these guys are in your rotation. So Vince Williams Jr., I have him 34th on my board. He rounds out, I guess, like my starting 5 of my guys, where I have Dyson Daniels, Benedict Mathurin, Tari Eason, Ishmael Kamagate, and Vince Williams Jr., who, by the way, I think would be a heck of a 5-man unit, by the way. I think that they all play off of each other very well.
And my last note about Vince Williams Jr., in case anybody hasn't gotten the chance to go back and watch the VCU tape on him, or doesn't have access to all that VCU film, is somebody who has played in the G League Elite Camp / Combine the last 2 days. So that video, or those games, I should say, were televised on the G League YouTube channel. So that is free for anybody to access. Just go back and watch those games. You need a glimpse of Vince Williams Jr. Did a great job playing at the G League Combine. So, Stephen, that's it, man. your final thoughts about this draft cycle, about Draft Deeper, about No Ceilings. Just leave it all on the floor before we part ways.
Yeah, man. I'm gonna wax poetic here. So just everybody listening, I love you so much. Just the fact that I am where I am, for people who know me, who have been rocking with me for a long time, would remember me from. And Nathan, this is where we met. I ran a podcast called Breaking the Game on the prior network that I was, with Off the Ball Network, and it was an NBA centric podcast. And I had sponsorship and things like that. Things were going great. That network started getting a lot of guys who wanted to talk NBA. So this year, what I wanted to do is I wanted to spread my wings. I wanted to cover the draft exclusively because Nathan, guys like you, Corey, other guys that we've had on Draft Deeper as guests, they would come on, and it was like my favorite conversation. So this season, I started a little podcast called Draft Capital, and I started a little Substack newsletter called Stephen G Hoops, and I would offer my thoughts and opinions about prospects. And as the season wore on, Nathan and I started to get to know the No Ceilings, what I referred to at the time on Draft Capital as the No Ceilings Collective. It's a family. I had an idea of that when I was kind of watching from afar, but now that I'm ingratiated into the collective, it is a family, man. And I love the work that we do. And I want to give some special shout outs real quick, Nathan, if you'll entertain me on that. First off, I talked about, Chris LeBron of the Off the Ball Network. I'll forever just appreciate him for giving me the opportunity to join his network and get to meet incredible people. I've got to interview so many awesome guests. And, when I had Draft Capital, Mark Schindler, who has taken off like a rocket this year, like, oh my gosh, having him and, his basketball news, colleague, and Matt Babcock, who, Nathan, I know that you respect the heck out of as well. A mutual friend of ours, Chuck from Chucking Darts. I've had guys like Chip Jones, CJ Margisani, Lee Branscombe, Stone Hansen, Keandre of Hoop Intellect, Jake Waterhouse of Crashing Hoops, which is also where Simon Rath, who is just a friend of everybody on Draft Twitter. Have to give a big shout out to Chad Ford, who that was like a career milestone for me, was getting to interview him as a guy who was in my personal rotation on listens. And then I also got to shout out Matt Penny of the Game Theory podcast, who has just been far too kind and more available to me than I deserve. But, just a guy who I respect the heck out of. And Nathan, I got to give shout outs to some of the guests that I've had a chance to interview with you here on Draft Deeper. Shout out to Coach Spinella of the Box and One, our guy Yoda Rashard Phillips of Sports Talk 2319, my guy Urson Demir, CJ Moore of The Athletic. Shout out again to Matt Penny, Jacob Polachek of Zag's blog, and of course our guy Bryce Simons of the Pistons Pulse and Detroit Bad Boys family there. So shout out to the No Ceilings Collective. You guys are my brothers. I love y'all. Shout out to Kevin, best producer in the business. And again, Nathan, thank you for the opportunity for, not just welcoming me to No Ceilings, but just being like, hey, dude, like, I want you on Draft Deeper. That was huge for me because, Nathan, like you mentioned way earlier in the show, I listened to you before like this was even a thought in anyone's head that you and I were going to be co-hosting together. So the fact that you and I are, taking Draft Deeper to new heights and new places along with our brothers at No Ceilings, far more than I deserved. It's been a hell, excuse my language, it's been a hell of a first year covering the NBA draft. I'm incredibly proud of what we've done at No Ceilings, and I can't wait to see just how far we've come when I come back from going where I'm going, man.
There's been a lot accomplished between Draft Deeper and obviously No Ceilings in a very short amount of time. I cannot wait to see where all of this continues to go in the future. So thank you, Stephen, like I said, for everything you've done for this show, for No Ceilings as a collective. You will be back. This is not a goodbye. This is a see you later.
Absolutely.
And I will be ecstatic to have you back in the fold with all of us for the 2023 draft cycle. But that is going to do it for this episode of the podcast. Thank you so much for listening, as well as subscribing. If you did not get to listen to or watch the No Ceilings live stream over on YouTube, we will have the reaction video posted and will remain there on YouTube. We will also have the audio from that live show over on the No Ceilings NBA podcast feed. Definitely make sure you are subscribed over there. Make sure you are subscribed to this podcast as well, Draft Deeper, wherever you get your podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. Make sure you're following me on Twitter at Draft Deeper. Make sure you're following Stephen on Twitter at Stephen G Hoops. And make sure you're following No Ceilings on Twitter at No Ceilings NBA. And so are subscribed to the Substack, NoCeilingsNBA.com, where we will continue to pump out content every Monday through Friday leading up to the draft. Trust me, there is so much more coming on the written front from all of us, as well as the podcast front. So definitely make sure you are locked into every single platform that we have and are continuing to create content for. But until we meet again, thank you all for listening, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week.
Much love, everybody.